Online with Terry Jeffrey, a CNS News production.
Hi, and welcome to this edition of Online with Terry Jeffrey. Our guest today is Louis Fisher. Louis Fisher is with the Constitution Project, but before that, he worked for 4 decades for the Library of Congress, including for the Congressional Research Service and as a specialist on constitutional law. Fisher earned his doctorate in political science from the New School for Social Research, and he has taught at Georgetown, American University, Catholic University, Indiana University, Johns Hopkins, William and Mary School of Law, and the Catholic University School of Law. He has written numerous books and articles about the limits that the Constitution puts on federal power, including on the war power, and he is the author of Presidential War Power, which we're going to talk about today. Lou, thanks for coming in. I really appreciate it. You know, there's a renewed interest on the part of the American people in recent days about the Constitution and the framing of the Constitution and what the founders believed and what they understood the document to be and mean. I think you've done an outstanding job in your career in this book of explaining the war power and how it was truly understood by the framers. And I'd just like to walk through some of the history that you've researched and studied. If you go back before 1776 and the Declaration of Independence, and the United States was then, they were colonies of Britain, they were part of the British Empire. Under that system, before America created, who had the power to bring Great Britain into war, to initiate military conflict?
Well, the power not only over war, but all of foreign affairs, everything external was centered in the king. He did not need any authority from Parliament. Parliament could try to cut off money, and they would try that power of the purse. But the initiative always lay with the king. So that was the model, not only William Blackstone in the 1760s, but the famous John Locke, 1690. He said there's legislative powers, executive powers, and there's something he called federative powers. That was external affairs, foreign affairs. And he said that's for the executive. Legislative branch has no connection with external affairs.
So both Locke and Blackstone, who American founding fathers read, of course, they stated that in the British system it was the monarch who had the power over war and the use of military force. So, for example, in the French and Indian War in the 1750s that George Washington fought as a colonial officer, that war was fought even by the Americans under the authority of the British Crown.
That's true, yes.
Okay, so we come forward in time. Americans declare their independence in July 1776, and the first government is formed under the Articles of Confederation. And you quote in your book the 9th article, which says, "The United States and Congress assembled shall have the sole and exclusive right and power of determining on peace and war," unquote.
Yes, and states, of course, could do something of a defensive nature, but anything of going to war, that was for Congress alone.
So this was a pretty dramatic change right away from the British system. They weren't going to have some king or some executive who was going to decide whether the United States would go to war.
It's also dramatic in the sense that we only had one branch of government, the Continental Congress. There was no separate judiciary. There was no separate executive. So everything was in the Continental Congress. So that's true from the break from England up to 1789. So the Continental Congress, we had one branch of government.
Now, at the same time, this Congress made one of their own, George Washington, the commander of their army. Who did George Washington work for?
Well, you mean after 1789?
Yeah, during the Revolutionary War. Under this 9th article.
He worked for Congress, and he had to go, different committees would take care of trying to get the war efficient, and he and his people in the war would have to go to Congress for all authority each time.
Even though he was the commander-in-chief, he was under the legislative authority of the Continental Congress. Okay, so America wins the war. They sign the treaty with Great Britain. They're a free and independent country. They're operating under the Articles of Confederation, but you have a lot of people who thought that there wasn't sufficient power in the central government to really handle the affairs of the nation. The Constitutional Convention meets in 1787. And they talk about the war power. Now, what did the draft of the Constitution that came up for consideration in the Constitutional Convention, what did it say about the war power?
You know, they tried in early drafts in the Constitution to figure that out, but months would go by until August when they really focused on what a president could do. And they agreed that, particularly if Congress is not in session, that the president could repel, quote, repel sudden attacks. So certain defensive powers. But anything of actually taking the United States from a state of peace to a state of war, the president would have to go to Congress for authority.
Now the actual language that was approved and ratified is Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11, which says Congress shall have the power to declare war, grant letters of marque and reprisal, and make rules concerning captures on land and water. And of course, elsewhere in Article 1, Section 8, they have the powers of Congress to raise armies and navies and regulate them and maintain them. On August 17th of 1787, is that the crucial day really in the Constitution?
That's a big day, sure.
Now, so in Madison's notes, one of the key sources of what went on there, the first thing it says is quote, to make war. Why is that what they started with that day?
That was, the original draft said to make war. And it's an interesting phrase. And of course, some people said, well, suppose Congress is not in session, and they finally changed to make war to declare war, which is in the Constitution.
Right, and this was offered by, according to Madison's notes, it says Mr. Madison and Mr. Gerry moved to insert declare, striking out make war, leaving to the executive the power to repel sudden attacks.
Yes.
So they weren't trying to take the war power away from Congress. They were simply trying to give the president the power to take defensive action in an emergency.
Yes, that's true.
And it also says in the notes that Mr. Butler, this is Pierce Butler of South Carolina, I believe, he says the objections against the legislature lie in a great degree against the Senate. So here's a person in the Constitutional Convention on August 17th, when they were actually considering how they were going to settle the war power in the Constitution, who did not want to give it to the legislature. He said he was for vesting the power in the president, who will have all the requisite qualities and not make war, but when the nation will support it.
And he was the only one who said that, and as you know from the debate, that other framers were just stunned that anyone could give that power to the president. And later, Pierce Butler backed away a bit. He recognized he was out by himself and no one would support that argument.
I believe in the state ratifying convention, he actually explained the war power, if I remember correctly. I believe it was Elbridge Gerry, who was co-author, if I understand the notes correctly, of Madison of the actual language, which they said would give the president the power to repel sudden attacks, who said in the Constitutional Convention, apparently after hearing Pierce Butler, Gerry said he never expected to hear in a republic a motion to empower the executive alone to declare war.
That word republic, I think a lot of people in the United States today do not know what that word meant, but the framers were setting up a very radical notion of self-government that was not true in anywhere in the world. So self-government meant that citizens would vote for your policy holders, and the policy holders would reflect self-government. And that's what a republic is, or small r Republican government. And I think most people today would have no idea what the significance of those words.
And then a little bit later in this same debate, on August 17, 1787, when they're deciding on the war power, Mr. Mason, I take it that's George Mason?
Yes.
Of Virginia. It says, Mr. Mason was against giving the power of war to the executive because not safely to be trusted with it, or to the Senate because not so constructed as to be entitled to it. He was for clogging rather than facilitating war, but for facilitating peace. And then he said he preferred declare to make.
Okay, and the clogging, the reason he would use words like that is if you go to war, it's part of the deliberative process. It's not the decision of a single person. It's the whole elected officials and the legislative body making that decision.
George Mason wanted it to be difficult for the U.S. to go to war.
Yes, fully debated and fully understood what we're doing.
And interestingly enough, he made very clear that he accepted James Madison and Elbridge Gerry's amendment. He said, declare, that's good by him. So even though he wanted to make it very difficult to go to war and he wanted to be in legislature, not in the executive, declare was good by him.
You know, a lot of people make too much of that make, declare, change, because later, what is make? Because even the Supreme Court and lower courts would say that the power to declare and make war is with Congress. So the change from those two words, from make to declare, didn't open the gates to any independent presidential power.
You believe it means exactly what Elbridge Gerry and James Madison said it meant when they actually offered it.
I think it meant a lot of things. One is that decision to take the country from a state of peace to state of war was for the legislative branch, not for the president. It also, and the notes show it, it was a rejection of the British model. And Alexander Hamilton, of course, he said, I love the British model, but it doesn't fit here with a Republican government. So everyone knew what they were rejecting, that British model. And Blackstone, all those prerogatives, and you named a lot of them, to give to the executive in the British model, not one is given to the president. They're either expressly, as you say, in Article 1, or with treaties and appointing ambassadors. They're shared between the president and the Senate.
And the Senate combined. Let's go back to Alexander Hamilton for a moment. I think he's remembered perhaps correctly as being the leading advocate of a strong executive at the time of the formulation of the Constitution. And I believe you write in your book that on June 17th, at the Constitutional Convention, so about a month or so, or a couple of months before they actually settled the war power, he gave a long speech detailing his own vision of the Constitution. And what did he say about the war power? This is Hamilton's own personal vision of the way the Constitution should work.
He would have given it to the Senate, but he would not have given it to the executive or the president. So and Hamilton recognized it was setting up a republic here. So he understood that the British model, although he loved it, had no application here.
And so the strongest advocate of executive power in the Constitutional Convention, he said, let's give it to the Senate.
Yes.
Not to the president.
Right.
And he said the president then would have the power to conduct a war once it was initiated by the Senate.
Yes, and there's several reasons for the Commander-in-Chief clause. One is civilian supremacy. The person running the war is not an admiral or a general. It's a civilian. And of course, the civilians in Congress are the ones who can provide funding and authority for the president. So the Commander-in-Chief never meant that the president can do anything he likes with troops.
Now, another interesting point, given that they'd all heard Alexander Hamilton, who they respected, say he thought it should go to the Senate, and I believe he wasn't the only person who thought that the Senate should have the power. But what the language actually said, and what Madison had recommended, was that Congress, not the Senate.
Both chambers, yes, both chambers.
So it takes both the House and Senate under the Constitution to initiate military hostilities or war. All right, so this Constitution goes out to the states for ratifying conventions. Was the war power discussed in the ratifying conventions?
It was. There were a lot of people anxious at the ratifying convention of giving too much power to central government. So the effort by all these people in the ratifying convention says this is very, very modest. We're not packing all power in the president. He has no power to go to war on his own judgment. So the whole hope of the Federalists during that time was to convince people that this is a constitution that respects self-government.
And did not Alexander Hamilton himself make that point about the war power in the Federalist Papers?
He contrasted the limited powers of the president versus what the king had.
Right. So when the state conventions were ratifying the Constitution, they clearly understood, because of what was debated in the conventions and what was written in the newspapers at the time and so forth, that they were not creating a central government in which an executive would have the power to take the country to war.
That's quite true.
He would not have that power that Elbridge Gerry said he never expected an executive to have in a republic. That's right. That's the cost. Now, I found very compelling in your book, you move forward from there and you show how people who had been at the Constitutional Convention or had been involved in the ratifying process, who were then in the government of the United States, how they viewed the war power and what it meant, which I think is pretty decisive in determining what the understanding was. Tell us about George Washington and how George Washington, of course, was the president of the Constitutional Convention. How did he view the war power and use it as president of the United States?
Well, he said to his cabinet people, particularly the Secretary of War, that you may not use military force in any offensive measure, that you have to go to Congress to get authority. So in line with the repel sudden attacks, military always would have certain freedom to act in a defensive manner. So he's very, and we were, of course, extremely fortunate to have someone like Washington set precedents, because whatever the U.S. Constitution says in text, precedents count a lot. And he was a very cautious person in making sure that the government did not overstep its powers.
He clearly and consciously understood that when he, as the first president, took certain actions, he was defining what the correct role of the chief executive was in our republic.
Yes.
Now, you also, it wasn't with George Washington and his administration, this question of defending the nation and using the military was not an abstract question. This was a very real question for him at times, was it not?
Yes, it had been in the past, and many of them had fought in military conflicts. So today, particularly after 9/11, people say that, oh, times have changed, so there's a big emergency. Well, they knew all about emergency power, and they had fought in wars, they bled and died, so they knew what emergencies were.
They knew war, and they knew being attacked.
Yes.
Now, in your book, you mentioned an incident involving Indians, Creek Indians, I believe, that were in territories that were beyond the limits of the United States at that time. I believe they belonged to Spain. How did that incident come up, and why was that indicative of the way Washington understood war?
Washington, again, very cautiously told his cabinet people that you may not take any offensive initiatives against Indians. You can only act in a defensive manner. So he's very clear on giving that instruction.
So when Indians came out of foreign territory, I guess at that time it was controlled by Spain, and attacked people in the United States in Georgia or South Carolina and fled back, Washington's position was that U.S. forces could defend the U.S. territory and defend the Americans against these attacks, but he did not want them going out into foreign territory and attacking the Indians.
You always have, when you're attacked from an area that's not your territory and the attackers go back into the territory, you always have a certain amount of freedom to chase a certain distance.
Right.
So you always have some liberty to do that.
But he did not initiate a war against the Indians.
No.
And he, if he wanted to, he could have gone to Congress and said, I would like you to authorize the use of military force against these Indians out in this other territory. But he did not do that.
He would have to do that. He did not.
Apparently did not want to go to war with those Indians.
Well, you can imagine the first 8 years under George Washington how vulnerable the United States was. Just a few states along the eastern seaboard, very strong powers around the world who would like to take advantage of that weakness. So he was not going to take risk with a young country.
So if we use this model that George Washington set, having been at the he was there on August 17th, 1787. He heard what Madison and Elbridge Gerry said. Taking that model as this is the correct understanding of the power of the president in using military force. If the U.S. is attacked, he needs to defend the country. He needs to defend the people. He can use the military in that regard, but he cannot initiate an offensive action without prior congressional authorization. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Let's move forward in time and see how this has evolved, and I know you detail some of this in your book. Under John Adams, the French and the British were at war. And there came up a question of, and this is a question I think persists to this day, what is the difference between, quote unquote, declaring war and getting congressional authorization to use the military in limited means, or to even authorize private American citizens to use force against a potential enemy?
Alexander Hamilton in the Federalist Papers pointed out that the formal declaration was going into disuse in Europe. So the first war we had against France in 1798, the Quasi-War, that was not declared, but there were about 20 statutes, and people knew by passing those authorizations they were going to go to war. Everyone understood that. And then the Supreme Court in 1800, 1801 said that Congress has a choice. It could either do a formal declaration or an authorization. So it's been the understanding from the start.
So right. So in other words, Congress, when there are certain hostile acts that the U.S. or U.S. citizens took against the French Navy, for example, in the late 1790s, Congress actually passed legislation authorizing those acts.
Yes.
But they did not declare war against France.
But constitutionally, they're equivalent. They're the same.
In other words, what I'm trying to get at is that the earliest Congresses, this was at a time where people who sat in the Constitutional Convention were sitting in the U.S. Congress and were watching this. They understood that their power under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11 of the Constitution extended to authorizing limited military acts that were not under a declaration of war and did not encompass total conflict with the foreign nation, but did involve authorizing the president as commander-in-chief to use the military of the United States, or to use privateers even, to do specific things that we thought were in our national interest.
And also, it's called quasi-war for different reasons. One reason is that it was a naval war. This was no authority to go onto the land in France. This was a naval war. So Congress, through authorization, can define what the scope of the operation will be.
And they said, for example, that the U.S. could take French ships at sea.
Yeah.
They could capture French
Yeah.
ships. This was retaliation for the French taking. Why did they do that, by the way?
Well, a lot of these military wars came out of conflict over commerce and on the seas. And the British were known for impressing U.S. sailors into British wars. So a lot of the wars came out of the naval activities.
So let me kind of make a jump from John Adams and the Congress in the late 1790s to today. If the President of the United States and Congress in the late 1790s, a decade after the Constitution was written and ratified, believed that the Congress must authorize the President even to allow action against a French ship on the high seas, is that analogous to the President needing an authorization of Congress now to take action against Muammar Gaddafi in Libya?
I think President Obama had an obligation to get authority up front. Obama, as you know, reached out to NATO, reached out to the Security Council, reached out to the Arab League. That was back in February. So at that time, he should have reached out to Congress. And when he finally, after the 60 days period elapsed, he wrote to Congress, I think 2 Fridays ago, and said it's much better when the two branches work in concert. And we're much stronger that way. Well, if he believed that, then he should have in February done exactly that, come to Congress and the American public and explain why military action is necessary.
And of course, President Obama or any member of Congress can read your book, or they can go back, especially with the internet now, and they can personally read James Madison's notes of how the framers settled on the language. But in your view, there's no doubt that George Washington or John Adams, they would never have even taken the kind of limited military action Obama's taken in Libya without Congress authorizing it first.
No question. I want to just say one thing. A lot of people talk about framers' intent or original intent. The framers didn't get a lot of things correct. I don't think anyone today would defend the framers allowing slavery to continue or not giving women the right to vote. But on the war power, they made a judgment that you should never give power to one person, the president, to go to war, because John Jay in the Federalist No. 4 spoke about when they look at executives going to war, it was not for the benefit of the country. It was ruinous for countries, of lives lost, fortune squandered. So today we have to ask, was that judgment back then in the 1780s not valid today? To me, it's just as valid. It's just a basic principle of human nature. You don't give that power to one person.
Well, it's an excellent point you make. What you're saying, if I understand you, that they thought they had put together a system here for initiating military hostility that would make sure the interests of the nation were at risk here and not the interests of a particular individual or party or section.
Yes.
Now, you also make a good point that there were things that the Constitution counted slavery. Women could not vote. These are things, however, that the Constitution itself allowed change. You can amend the Constitution. We had the 13th Amendment to abolish slavery, the 14th Amendment to provide equal protection of the law. We amended the Constitution to allow women to vote. And those things were corrected through the wisdom of the country over time. But the war power has not been amended, correct?
Has not been amended on paper, and I don't think it's been amended in spirit. But you and I know that after World War II, we have moved to a situation of Truman going to war on his own, never coming to Congress, Clinton repeatedly using military force, and we are, to me, acting unconstitutionally.
Let's get to the modern day in a moment. I just want to ask you a couple more things about back then. You mentioned a Supreme Court case. Was Bass v. Tingey is the case? So we had this non-war conflict with France, but it did involve military activity.
Well, it was war. It was war.
Limited war, imperfect war, I guess. But so the Congress had authorized it.
Yes.
The president had gone ahead with it. So you had a president who was alive at the time of the Constitution, the ratification, congressmen who were actually involved in writing the Constitution to approve this. It went to the Supreme Court, this question. of a limited war, whether or not, and what happened? What did the court say?
Well, the court said when we look to the war power, we look entirely to Congress. We don't look to the president at all. Because those cases in 1800 and 1801 were whether that was war, since it wasn't declared.
Right.
So he said on matters of war, and it was John Marshall, on matters of war, we look solely to Congress for our guidance.
Even whether it's a quote-unquote imperfect war where we're just taking a French ship, or whether it's a declaration of war and there's total conflict between the two nations.
Either one.
So this idea from the Constitutional Convention that the only time the president could unilaterally use military force was to repel a sudden attack. When you look at the first 15 years of the Republic, acts of Congress, acts of the President, even the Supreme Court, they all went back and they ratified this idea. It's
Yes,
with Congress.
Also, fascinating case, 1804, Little v. Beream, where Congress by statute told President John Adams you can capture French ships going to an island, and he had a proclamation to or from. Well, he changed the law. So that goes to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court says, no, I mean, Congress decides national policy.
Even on that level of detail.
Yeah.
They can fine-tune it however they want because that's their constitutional power.
Yes, yes.
Okay, so we flash forward to, well, let's talk about just some big conflicts of the 20th century. World War I. Did Woodrow Wilson go to Congress before he went to war?
They all went to Congress. From 1789 to 1950, every president, Woodrow Wilson, Franklin D. Roosevelt, the rest, Polk, they all went to Congress either for authorization or declaration.
So whether it was a major war, if it was something like the Mexican-American War, the Spanish-American War, or it was a smaller conflict, there was authorization from Congress in every instance.
Every time. And the Spanish-American War is a nice example because the claim was, I think it was false, that Spain was responsible for blowing up the main ship in Havana. So that you could say the president could then use defensive action, but McKinley didn't do that. He comes to Congress and asks for authority.
Right. So Lee, you've gone through and you've chronicled all these conflicts. I mean, you've gone back and you've looked at this and actually pulled up the record. I mean, this is not supposition. This is just a fact that in all of these conflicts, all the way through World War II, of course, everybody knows Franklin Roosevelt went to Congress and got authorization and declarations of war against Japan and Germany.
But even he, by the way, he could have said, oh, we've been attacked at Pearl Harbor. I can repel sudden attacks, and I can do it on my own. But, of course, as you say, he came to Congress.
He didn't do that. So all the way from 1787 to 1941, our leaders, our members of Congress, our presidents, they respected that understanding of the Constitution.
Yes.
1950, what happens?
1950, by the way, Truman had told the Senate in 1945 with the UN Charter that if I ever use U.S. troops in a UN operation, I will come to you and get approval first. And Congress passed the statute in 1945, the UN Participation Act. You come to us first. So in 1950, he goes to war against Korea. He never ever came to Congress, either before or after, for authority. And you probably remember that at a press conference, some reporter said, President Truman, what we're doing in Korea, is that a war? He says, no. And then the reporter said, would you call it a UN police action? That's it. It's a police action.
That's what he called it. Tens of thousands of Americans died in that police action in Korea. Now, did not Robert Taft, who's the Senate Republican leader at the time, he objected verbally.
He was one of the few, and he got attacked by historians for not understanding the Constitution. And those historians later apologized that Taft understood and they did not.
Right. Now, from 1950 forward, after Truman sort of let the genie out of the bottle and created this, at least appearance of unilateral presidential power in the use of U.S. military, there have been conflicts where the president acted unilaterally. There have been others where the president has gone to Congress and gotten authorization. Sometimes, I know you've pointed out, they didn't want to, but the political pressure forced them to. In the last decade, you know, I know you believe that George Herbert Walker Bush did not want to go to Congress, for example, for the first Persian Gulf War. He did, and he got authorization. Clinton did some things where he did not have authorization.
He never came to Congress one time for authority, Clinton.
He just felt he could do it.
Invade Haiti, go into Bosnia, go into Kosovo.
You had George W. Bush, he had two major and ultimately very controversial conflicts. Both he went to Congress for authorization. Do you believe that the genie was being put back in the bottle at that point? That, you know, whether or not George W. Bush wanted to go to Congress, the fact that he did and he got the authorization was starting to reconstruct an original understanding of the Constitution?
I think it's quite true that George W. Bush did not. He did a lot of things unilaterally, the warrantless surveillance and many other actions. But you're right, going to war, he came to Congress both times through the front door to get statutory authority. The problem of putting the genie back in the bottle, first of all, I would like to make it clear that in the UN Charter, you cannot have the President and the Senate through the treaty process, the UN Charter or NATO. You cannot have those two actors take the power of Congress and the House of Representatives and give it to either the Security Council or to NATO countries. And I think even people who read presidential power broadly know that that's not possible. You cannot use a treaty to amend the Constitution.
Alienate the sovereign authority of the United States.
Yeah, but that's exactly what President Obama did by going to the Security Council for Libya. He said, yeah, I have authorization from the Security Council. It's not authorization under U.S. constitutional law.
Now, what is, in your view, and obviously President Obama is not the first one to do this, you have a House of Representatives, at least of the opposite party. Mm-hmm. Theoretically, in modern American politics, the opposite party acts like a check on the other party if Congress doesn't. What is the proper remedy for Congress in dealing with the president who violates this power?
You know, I'm not going to recommend that the House Judiciary Committee hold impeachment hearings, but I would like members of Congress and the public to say that nothing would be more impeachable than a president who takes the country to war without coming to Congress, does it unilaterally. That, to me, is the gravest. So I would like people to be educated, including members of Congress, to be educated that that is a very grave offense.
At this time where you have this, all this talk, excellent talk in my view, the Tea Party, they're saying let's get back to the constitutional principles, what the framers believed, what this republic was all about from the beginning. Do you believe this is an opportunity to get members of Congress at least to focus on reading these documents that you've studied in your lifetime and really coming to understand in this most important power of the federal government, what it means, what their responsibilities are?
It should be. And if members of Congress, since I worked with them for 40 years, some take care of their institution, many do not take care of their own institution. That was an assumption by the framers that each branch would take care of itself and push away encroachments. If members of Congress don't do it, then I think constituents and the general public have to say that it's your duty. You have to protect yourself. Because if you don't protect yourself, you're not protecting us. And we're ending up with a concentration of power in the president, which is not constitutional. So I think more, and the media doesn't help. The media often says, oh, the president has all these really brilliant people around him, and he knows what the national interest is, and so forth. So the media plays into that.
And they generally don't know the constitutional history either. Not
very well, and even scholars do it. Arthur Schlesinger is famous for the imperial president. Well, he helped build up the imperial president with his books on Andrew Jackson and FDR and John Kennedy. So scholars have been very negligent on having this really idealistic view of the president. He's someone with goodness and expertise and all of that. So purely imaginary.
Lou Fisher, have some people follow in your footsteps and go back and look at the things you've done such a great job looking at yourself.
Thanks so much.
Thank you very much.
Okay.